Welcome to Silent Screams, where the boundaries between reality and the unknown dissolve into the shadows. Tonight, I'll be your guide into a chilling journey, a place where eerie truths and cryptic legends collide. Sit back, dim the lights, and let the whispers of rain carry you into the heart of our story. The rain had been relentless that night, drumming against the tin roof of the cabin and pulling in the uneven ground outside. For Jenna, this was supposed to be a quiet retreat, a chance to disconnect from the pressures of city life. Nestled deep in the woods, far from cell towers and human chatter, the cabin seemed perfect for a weekend of solitude. But as the hours dragged on, the solitude began to feel oppressive, almost alive. She lit a candle and placed it by the window. The glow cast long, flickering shadows across the room, giving the illusion that the walls themselves were breathing. Outside, the darkness was thick, the rain obscuring the shapes of the towering pines. It wasn't until she sat down with her book that she noticed it, the faint but unmistakable sound of footsteps squelching through the mud. At first, Jenna dismissed it as a trick of her imagination, her mind playing games in the quiet. But the sound came again, deliberate, heavier this time, and closer. Her pulse quickened. She tried to peer through the window, but the rain distorted everything into a watery blur. Gripping the edge of the table, she whispered to herself, "It's probably just an animal. Maybe a deer." But the logical part of her brain couldn't explain why the steps were so steady, so deliberate. Whatever it wasn't wandering aimlessly. It was moving with purpose. The footsteps stopped. Silence fell, broken only by the relentless patter of rain and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. Jenna exhaled slowly, willing her heartbeat to steady. But then came another sound, softer this time, a faint tapping on the window pane. Her eyes darted toward the sound. Nothing. The window was empty, save for the rain streaking down its surface. She stood, her legs trembling as she moved toward the window. Her hand hovered over the latch. "No," she thought. "Don't open it." But her curiosity burned hotter than her fear. She unlocked the window and pushed it open slightly, just enough to let in the cold, wet air. The forest beyond was still, as if holding its breath. "Hello," she called, her voice barely audible above the rain. No response. But just as she was about to shut the window, a flash of lightning illuminated the woods. For a split second, she saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the tree line, its outline blurred but undeniably human. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch. It simply stood there, watching. Jenna slammed the window shut and locked it. Her hands shook as she grabbed her phone, only to remember there was no signal this far out. She cursed herself for coming here alone. The figure was gone by the time she glanced back at the window, but the uneasy feeling remained, like a weight pressing on her chest. She tried to distract herself, turning on the small radio she brought with her. Static filled the room, crackling and hissing before settling into a faint, distorted melody. It was an old tune, something she vaguely recognized but couldn't place. The music brought little comfort. In fact, it only made the atmosphere heavier, as if the air itself had thickened. Hours passed, or so it seemed. Jenna lost track of time as the rain persisted, and the cabin seemed to shrink around her. The tapping returned, more insistent this time. But now, it wasn't just the window. It came from the door, the walls, even the floorboards beneath her feet. She froze, paralyzed by the growing certainty that she wasn't alone. The candle flickered violently, as though caught in a sudden gust of wind, though the windows and doors were all shut. Then, as quickly as it began, the tapping stopped. Silence stretched taut, and Jenna dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, it was over. But hope was short-lived. A low, guttural whisper slithered through the room, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. It spoke no words, just a sound, a deep, vibrating hum that set her teeth on edge. She clutched the candle holder like a weapon, though she knew it would do little good. And then, the door creaked open. It didn't swing wide, just enough to reveal a sliver of darkness beyond. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and the air grew colder, heavy with a metallic tang that made her stomach churn. Jenna backed away, her feet stumbling over the uneven wooden floor. Her candle went out, plunging the room into darkness. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she fumbled for the flashlight on the table. The beam cut through the blackness, landing on the door. It was fully open now, swinging gently on its hinges. Beyond the threshold, the forest was no longer just trees and rain. Shapes moved in the shadows, slender, elongated forms that didn't quite make sense. They flickered in and out of focus, like static on an old television screen. Jenna screamed as one of the shapes stepped into the doorway. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs unnaturally long and bent at awkward angles. Its face, or what she assumed was its face, was obscured by darkness, but its presence radiated malevolence. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed against her eardrums. She bolted toward the back door, the flashlight bouncing wildly in her hand. Her mind raced with thoughts of escape, but every step she took seemed to take her deeper into the nightmare. The walls of the cabin seemed to shift, the wood creaking and groaning as if alive. She reached the door and flung it open, only to find herself staring at the same forest she'd seen moments ago. The rain continued to pour, but something was different now. The trees seemed closer, their gnarled branches reaching toward her like claws. Jenna hesitated, caught between the terror of staying and the unknown horror waiting outside. But when she heard the sound of something heavy dragging across the floor behind her, the decision was made for her. She ran into the rain-soaked woods, the flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. The figures followed, their movements unnaturally smooth and swift, gliding between the trees without sound. Her lungs burned as she pushed forward, her boots sinking into the mud with every step. The rain blinded her, and the flashlight flickered, threatening to go out. She tripped over a root and fell hard, the breath knocked from her chest. When she looked up, she realized she wasn't alone. Jenna lay sprawled in the mud, her breathing ragged as she scrambled to her hands and knees. The rain plastered her hair to her face, but it couldn't mask the faint sound of something approaching. The dragging noise had returned, heavier now, almost rhythmic, as if whatever was pursuing her took deliberate pleasure in each calculated step. She forced herself to stand, ignoring the ache in her knees and the sting of a fresh cut on her palm. The forest around her seemed alive, every branch creaking, every shadow shifting as if it harbored some unseen watcher. Her flashlight flickered weakly, casting uneven light on the twisted roots and soaked underbrush. She dared not look behind her, afraid of what she might see. Instead, she staggered forward, deeper into the suffocating darkness, the rain relentless against her skin. The dragging sound grew louder, closer. But now it wasn't alone. A low, guttural growl rumbled through the trees, vibrating in her chest like a second heartbeat. Jenna froze, her ears straining to locate the source. The growl wasn't constant, it came in bursts, broken by an unsettling silence that felt far worse than the noise itself. It was playing with her, she realized, like a predator toying with its prey. Her trembling hand fumbled with the flashlight, turning it toward the trees. The beam caught something, a glint of movement just out of focus. She swung the light back, her breath catching in her throat. A figure stood there, partially obscured by the rain and branches. It was tall, impossibly so, with limbs that bent in unnatural angles. Its head tilted slightly, as if curious, though Jenna could feel no kindness in its gaze, only malice. And then it moved. Not in a way that made sense. It didn't step forward or lurch. Instead, it seemed to glide, closing the distance between them with horrifying ease. She stumbled backward, her flashlight dropping to the ground with a splash, the light extinguished in the mud. Blind now, she turned and ran, her bare hands clawing through wet leaves and branches. The growl followed her, growing louder, closer, accompanied by the sickening sound of something heavy dragging through the underbrush. She couldn't shake the feeling that the forest itself was conspiring against her. The roots seemed to reach for her feet, the branches lashed against her face like claws. Her lungs burned, each breath sharper than the last, but she couldn't stop, not even when her legs begged her to. Jenna's foot caught on something, another root or perhaps something more deliberate, and she fell hard. Her scream was muffled by the mud as her body slammed against the wet ground. She rolled onto her back, gasping, and there it was, looming over her. Close enough now that she could see its face, or rather, the absence of one. Where its eyes should have been, there were only deep, hollow voids. Its mouth hung open, too wide, as if unhinged, revealing jagged, mismatched teeth. It leaned closer, the rain cascading off its grotesque form, and she could hear it breathing, a wet, rattling sound that filled the space between them. In her panic, her hand brushed against something solid and cold, the flashlight. Without thinking, she grabbed it and swung it upward. The light sputtered back to life just as she aimed it directly at the creature's face. It recoiled with a deafening screech, a sound so high-pitched it sent sharp pains through her skull. She scrambled to her feet, the flashlight trembling in her grasp as she pointed it back toward the thing. But it was gone. Jenna didn't wait to question her luck. She ran again, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. The forest seemed endless now, an infinite maze of shadows and rain. She spotted what looked like a path ahead, a narrow break in the trees that might lead her to safety, or deeper into this nightmare. With no other option, she took it. The path twisted and turned, the ground slick with mud. She slipped more than once, each false ending. Fresh waves of pain through her bruised body. The growling had stopped, but she knew better than to feel relieved. The silence was worse. It felt like a trap, a momentary reprieve designed to lull her into a false sense of security. Then she saw it, a faint light in the distance. Hope surged in her chest, a fragile thing but enough to push her forward. The light grew brighter as she approached, revealing the outline of a small structure. It wasn't the cabin. This building was older, its wooden walls warped and moss-covered. The windows were broken, the glass glittering like jagged teeth in the rain. But it was shelter, and at this point, Jenna didn't care. She burst through the door, slamming it shut behind her. The interior was pitch black, the air thick with the smell of damp wood and decay. Her flashlight revealed a single room, cluttered with broken furniture and strange objects. Old photographs hung crookedly on the walls, their faces smudged and faded. A large mirror leaned against one corner, its surface cracked and smeared with something dark. Jenna leaned against the door, struggling to catch her breath. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for anything she could use as a weapon. A rusted crowbar lay near a pile of debris, and she grabbed it, the cold metal reassuring in her grip. She didn't trust the silence, not here, not after everything she'd seen. Her flashlight beam caught movement in the mirror. At first, she thought it was her reflection, but it wasn't. The figure in the glass was taller, its movements slower, more deliberate. She turned sharply, the crowbar raised, but the room behind her was empty. The mirror figure remained, staring at her with hollow eyes. And then it stepped out of the glass. Jenna screamed, the sound raw and primal as the figure emerged fully into the room. It moved toward her, its limbs bending unnaturally, the crack of its joints audible over the rain. She swung the crowbar, but it passed through the thing as if it weren't fully there. The creature didn't flinch, didn't falter. Its hand, or what passed for one, reached out, its touch colder than the rain outside. She stumbled backward, her legs giving out as she fell against the wall. The photographs around her seemed to shift, the faces within twisting into expressions of horror and pain. The creature loomed over her, its hollow eyes locking onto hers. Jenna's vision blurred, her body growing heavy, as if the thing was draining her very essence. And then, just as her consciousness began to fade, the door burst open. A deafening crash of thunder echoed through the room, and the creature recoiled, its form flickering like a dying flame. Jenna barely registered the figure standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the storm outside. It wasn't the same as the other shapes she'd seen. This one was human, or at least, it appeared to be. Before she could process what was happening, the figure stepped inside, its presence commanding the room. Jenna's grip on reality slipped further, and the last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was the creature's hollow gaze turning toward the newcomer.